This video was made possible by the support of our fantastic patrons. Thank you so much for your contributions, which help us to keep improving our content. You are amazing. Hello everyone, and welcome to a very special EDH gameplay video brought to you by Affinity for Commander. My name's Martin.
And my name's Alex.
This week's gameplay variant was chosen by our very first Mythic tier patron, Charla Kolek. We cannot thank you enough for the support that you offer to the channel, and we hope that you enjoy this game as much as we did.
Charla asked us to make a game containing the following: 4 Azorius commanders? Check. The addition of conspiracies? Check. And finally, plenty of counterspells. We'll let you decide if we achieved the last one.
I decided to sit this one out, given that I am rubbish at playing control decks, but still had a great time watching it. So without further ado, let's see those opening hands.
My commander is Raff Capashen, Ship's Mage. My opening hand consists of Geist of St. Traft, Azorius Signet, Hedron Archive, Swan Song, Ancient Tomb, Flooded Strand, and an island.
Chris's commander is Noyan Dar, Royal Shaper. He keeps an opening hand of Planar Birth, Teferi's Response, Settle the Wreckage, Play of the Game, Temple of the False God, Prairie Stream, and Cascading Cataracts.
Ren's commander is Isperia the Inscrutable. His opening hand is made of Kefnet the Mindful, Magus of the Moat, Cloud Blazer, Isperia Supreme Judge, a Plains, and 2 islands.
And finally, Dylan's commander is Medomai the Ageless. His opening hand contains Rhystic Study, the Chain Veil, Steel Shaper's Gift, Approach of the Second Sun, Prairie Stream, Irrigated Farmland, and Nykthos Shrine to Nyx. Before the game begins, I have randomly distributed 4 conspiracy cards to each player. Some of these begin the game revealed, whilst others remain hidden until later. Dylan reveals Power Play, allowing him to go first without dispute, and Sentinel Dispatch, which creates a 1/1 construct of Defender in his first upkeep.
Chris reveals World Knit, allowing his lands to tap for any colour.
Ren reveals Backup Plan, which lets him draw an additional hand of 7 cards. He chooses to keep his original hand and shuffles the other back into his library.
And last but not least, I reveal Hold the Perimeter. More upkeep shenanigans.
Dylan goes first thanks to Power Play, making a 1/1 construct with Defender and a 1/1 Goblin that can't block in his upkeep. He then plays Irrigated Farmland and passes to Chris.
In his upkeep, Chris makes a 1/1 Goblin that can't block, and then plays Prairie Stream. He then ends his turn.
Ren makes a 1/1 Goblin that can't block in his upkeep, plays an island, and passes the turn.
I make a 1/2 Soldier with Defender in my upkeep, and then play Ancient Tomb. I then tap the Tomb, taking 2 damage, and cast Azorius Signet, before passing to Dylan.
Dylan plays a Prairie Stream of his own, and then casts Steel Shaper's Gift. He searches his library for Assault Suit, puts it into his hand, and ends his turn.
Chris plays Mishra's Factory, and then passes to Ren.
Ren plays a Plains, and then passes the turn.
In my turn, I play an island, and continue the trend of passing without playing anything.
Dylan plays an island, and then casts Rhystic Study. Alex agrees to stop this as long as Ren and Chris don't counter his commander in his next turn, and a deal is made. Alex casts Swan Song, countering Rhystic Study and gifting Dylan with a 2/2 Flying Bird. Dylan then ends his turn.
For his turn, Chris plays Cascading Cataracts. He then passes to Ren.
Ren plays an island and passes the turn.
I play Glacial Fortress, and then cast my commander, Raff Capashen, Ship's Mage. I take 2 damage from my Ancient Tomb, and then end my turn.
Dylan starts his turn by playing Nykthos Shrine to Nyx. He then casts the Assault Suit that he tutored for last turn and passes to Chris.
Chris plays Maze of Ith, and then passes the turn.
In his turn, Ren casts Kefnet the Mindful. He then ends his turn.
I play an island, and then pass to Dylan.
Dylan plays a Darker Wastes and then ends his turn.
Chris starts his turn by playing Temple of the False God. He then casts Rhystic Study, and passes to Ren.
For his turn, Ren moves straight to combat. He attacks Chris with Kefnet, and Chris responds by tapping Maze of Ith, targeting the attacking god. Ren responds by cycling Nimble Obstructionist, countering the activated ability of the maze, and Chris responds to this by casting Teferi's Response. We've since had some debate as to whether or not this would have worked, as it was the land's ability that was targeted, not the land itself, but accepted that it did at the time. Chris draws 2 cards and Kefnet is removed from combat by the maze. In his second main phase, Ren plays Tranquil Cove, gaining a life and passes the turn. In his end step, Alex casts Teferi, Hero of Dominaria. He takes 2 damage from his tomb and pays the Rhystic Study tax to prevent Chris from drawing. From now on, take it that people are paying for the Rhystic Study tax unless otherwise stated, as there are going to be a lot of triggers. Alex then moves to his turn.
I play a Flooded Strand, pay a life, and sacrifice it to put Prairie Stream onto the battlefield. Next, I cast Treasure Map, and use Teferi's +1 ability to draw a card. Moving to combat, I attack Chris with Raff, and he takes 3 damage. I then go to my end step, untapping 2 lands thanks to Teferi's ability, and pass to Dylan.
In his turn, Dylan moves straight to combat. He attacks Teferi with his bird token, dealing him 2 damage. In his second main phase, Dylan casts Oath of Teferi. Chris draws from his Rhystic Study, and Dylan exiles one of his islands until the end of turn. He then passes to Chris.
Chris plays Reliquary Tower, and then casts Soul Ring. He then ends his turn.
Ren plays an island, and then moves to combat. He attacks Chris with Kefnet, and Chris uses his Maze of Ith to remove it from combat. In his post-combat main phase, Ren reveals one of his conspiracies, Brago's Favour. He uses it to lower the cost of his commander, who he then casts. Isperia the Inscrutable enters the battlefield, and Ren passes the turn. Alex responds by putting a landmark counter on his treasure map, scrying the top card of his library to the bottom, and then moves to his turn.
I begin my turn by using Teferi's +1 ability, drawing a card. Next, I play Cephalid Colosseum, and then move to combat. I attack Chris with Wrath, dealing him 3 damage, and then pass to Dylan.
In his turn, Dylan casts Contagion Clasp. He puts a -1/-1 counter on Isperia and moves to combat. Dylan attacks Teferi with his bird, dealing him 2 damage, and then ends his turn. Chris responds by casting Dig Through Time, and Alex counters it with Rewind. Alex loses a life from his Colosseum, untaps 4 lands, and Chris moves to his turn.
Chris starts his turn by casting Play of the Game, which I counter with Cryptic Command. I'll lose another life to my Colosseum to pay for Rhystic Study, and then draw a card from the command. Chris then passes the turn.
In his turn, Ren attacks Chris with Isperia and Kefnet. Not wanting to reveal his hand to the table, Chris uses his maze to remove Isperia from combat and takes 5 damage from Kefnet. In his second main phase, Ren casts Selfless Spirit. He then passes to Alex.
In my upkeep, I put another landmark counter on my treasure map and scry the top card of my library to the bottom. I then play Temple of Enlightenment, scrying another card to the bottom of my deck. Next, I use Teferi's +1 ability to draw a card and end my turn.
Dylan plays Magosi, the Water Veil, and then moves to combat. He attacks Chris with his bird, dealing him 2 damage, and then passes the turn.
Chris draws for his turn and then passes to Ren.
Ren goes straight to combat, attacking Dylan with Isperia and Teferi with Kefnet. Dylan responds by using his Contagion Clasp to proliferate the -1/-1 counter on Isperia, the loyalty counters on Teferi, and the landmark counters on Treasure Map. Alex then blocks Kefnet with Raff and flashes in Hedron Archive. Chris then responds to this by casting Disenchant, destroying Alex's treasure map. Raff is then destroyed and Dylan takes 1 damage from Isperia. Ren names Azor's Elocutors and Dylan reveals his hand. Everybody takes notes of what cards are revealed, taking notice of the Chain Veil and approach of the Second Sun. In his post-combat main phase, Ren casts Windborn Muse, and Alex responds by recasting his commander, paying 3 life due to his painful land base. Chris draws from his study and Ren ends his turn.
I play Sirigi Refuge, gaining a life. Next, I use Teferi's +1 ability to draw a card and pass to Dylan.
Dylan starts his turn by casting his commander, Medomai the Ageless. Chris draws a card from his Rhystic Study and Dylan reveals one of his conspiracies, Immediate Action. Moving to combat, Dylan attacks Alex with Medomai. Not wanting Dylan to have an extra turn, Chris uses his maze to untap the Sphinx. Dylan then passes the turn, to which Chris responds by casting Dismantling Blow, paying the kicker cost. He destroys Dylan's constructs, draws 2 cards, and then moves to his turn.
Chris starts his turn by playing a Plains, and then casts a Morphed spell. He then passes to Ren.
In his turn, Ren goes straight to combat. He attacks Alex with Isperia and Teferi with Kefnet. Alex responds by casting Urza's Ruinous Blast at instant speed. Chris responds to this by unmorphing Void Mage Apprentice, countering the spell. Alex then blocks Isperia with Raff and Teferi's loyalty is reduced to 0. In his second main phase, Ren casts Gisela the Broken Blade. He ends his turn, to which Alex responds by sacrificing his Cephalid Colosseum to draw 3 cards, and then discards 3 cards before moving to his turn.
I begin my turn by playing Temple of the False God, and then pass the turn.
Dylan starts his turn by casting Jace, Unraveller of Secrets. He uses Jace's -2 ability to return Selfless Spirit to Ren's hand, and then uses his +1 ability thanks to his Oath of Teferi. Dylan scries 1, then draws a card, and then moves to combat, attacking Alex with his commander. Alex responds by casting Path to Exile, exiling Medomai. Dylan puts an island onto the battlefield before passing to Chris, and Chris responds to this by revealing another of his conspiracies, Natural Unity. He named Plains as his chosen card, which everyone agrees was an unorthodox but brilliant choice. Chris then moves to his turn.
For his turn, Chris plays Darksteel Citadel, and then moves to combat. He attacks me with his Void Mage and Dylan with his Goblin. Both creatures are blocked and destroyed, and Chris moves to his post-combat main phase. He casts Planar Outburst, wiping the board of all creatures except for the indestructible Kefnet, and then casts Standstill. Chris then ends his turn.
Ren goes straight to combat once again, attacking Alex with Kefnet. Alex takes the 5 damage, and Ren then passes the turn. He discards down to 7, and Alex sacrifices Hedron Archive to draw 2 cards before moving to his turn.
I play an island, and then pass to Dylan.
Dylan uses Jace's +1 ability to scry the top card of his library to the bottom, and then draws a card. He plays Rogue's Passage, and then recasts his commander. Chris draws a card from his study, and then everybody other than Dylan draws 3 cards thanks to Standstill. Chris then counters Medomai with Cryptic Command, and also chooses to return Jace to Dylan's hand. Not yet finished, Chris reveals another conspiracy, Double Stroke. He copies his Cryptic Command, choosing to draw a card and return Kefnet to Ren's hand. Dylan then discards down to 7 and ends his turn.
Chris plays an island and then casts Aminato's Augury. I respond by casting my commander, revealing Brago's Favour as one of my conspiracies to lower his casting cost by 1. Chris draws a card from Mystic Study and then casts Arcane Denial. I respond with Negate, and Chris draws another card from his study. Raff enters the battlefield and Aminato's Augury resolves. Chris puts a Plains into play, casts Polar Lullaby, and clashes with Dylan. Chris wins the clash, preventing all 0 of Dylan's creatures from untapping in his next upkeep, and then casts Mystic Remora. Chris then casts Expedition Map, followed by Preordain. Finally finished, Chris passes to Ren.
In his turn, Ren recasts Kefnet. He then discards down to 7 and ends his turn.
I play an island, discard down to 7, and end my turn.
Dylan starts his turn by casting Sphinx of the Final Word. He then passes to Chris.
In his upkeep, Chris pays for his Remora's cumulative upkeep, and then casts Bribery, targeting Dylan. He searches Dylan's library and puts Iona Shield of Emeria onto the battlefield, naming Blue. Next, Chris casts Consecrated Land, enchanting it to his Mace of Ith. He then passes the turn.
In his turn, Ren wastes no time casting Wrath of God. Chris draws a card from his Remora and then casts Dream Fracture. Alex responds by flashing out Duplicants, exiling Iona with his robots. Wrath of God is then countered, Ren draws a card and Chris draws a card. Ren then plays an island and moves to combat. He attacks Chris with Kefnet and Chris takes 5 damage. Ren ends his turn and Alex flashes in Geist of Saint Traft and then moves to his turn.
I go straight to combat, attacking Dylan with Duplicant and Ren with my Geist and the 4/4 Angel that he produces. Dylan takes 7 damage, Ren takes 6, and I pass the turn.
Dylan draws for his turn, discards down to 7 and passes to Chris. Chris responds by sacrificing his Expedition Map and puts Inkmoth Nexus into his hand before moving to his turn.
In his upkeep, Chris pays Mystic Remora's cumulative upkeep cost and then plays Inkmoth Nexus. He then casts Ponder, followed by his commander, Noyan Dar, Royal Shaper. I respond by casting Glimmer of Genius, Chris draws a card, I scry 2, and then draw 2. Chris then passes to Ren.
Ren moves straight to combat, attacking Chris with Kefnet. Chris takes 5 damage and Ren moves to his second main phase. He casts Supreme Verdict, and Chris draws a card from Mystic Remora. Alex responds by flashing in Gilded Lotus, and Chris draws 2 cards. Chris then casts Dawn Charm, regenerating Noyan Dar. He puts 3+1/+1 counters on his Darksteel Citadel as a result of Noyan Dar's ability, and Alex responds by flashing in Coalition Relic. Chris draws a card, and then the board wipe resolves, leaving a bird god, a walking building, and an angry fishman on the battlefield. Ren then ends his turn, and Alex responds by putting a charge counter on his relic, before moving to his turn.
I begin my turn by casting Terminus. Chris draws and then casts Counterspell, targeting his Citadel with Noyan Dar's ability. I then respond by casting Mystical Confluence. Chris draws once more, Counterspell is countered, I draw 2 cards, and everyone's creatures are put on the bottom of their libraries. Next I play Tranquil Cove, gaining a life, and then pay 2 life to cast Empress Galena. Chris draws 2 cards, and I end my turn. Dylan responds by using his Contagion class to proliferate the age counters on Mystic Remora, and then moves to his turn.
In his turn, Dylan casts Fate Spinner, followed by Silent Arbiter. He then passes to Chris.
In his upkeep, Chris pays Mystic Remora's cumulative upkeep cost, and then chooses to skip his combat phase. Chris then plays Sea Crone Coast, casts Sacred Ground, and then passes the turn.
Ren also chooses to skip his combat phase and casts Land Tax. Chris draws 2 cards and Ren ends his turn.
I choose to skip my combat phase and then cast the Antiquities War. Chris draws a card and I put Sensei's Divining Top into my hand and then play a Hallowed Fountain to my land for turn, having it enter tapped. I then pass to Dylan.
Dylan starts his turn by casting Gilded Lotus. Chris draws a card and Dylan then casts Clock of Omens. Chris draws once more and responds by casting Rewind, countering the clock and untapping 4 lands. Moving to combat, Dylan attacks Alex with his Arbiter and Alex blocks with his Empress. Dylan then passes the turn and Chris casts Cyclonic Rift, paying the overload cost. Alex goes to counter the spell and Chris persuades him to let it resolve by claiming that he will knock Dylan out of the game next turn if it resolves. Alex likes the sound of this and the spell resolves, returning a lot of cards to their owner's hands. Dylan discards down to 7 and then Chris moves to his turn.
In his upkeep, Chris refuses to pay the Mystic Remora's cumulative upkeep cost and sacrifices it. He then plays an island and animates Inkmoth Nexus before moving to combat. Chris attacks Dylan with his land and then reveals his final conspiracy, Incendiary Descent. He uses the Descent to give the Nexus +9/+0 until the end of turn, dealing Dylan 10 infect damage, removing him from the game. Chris then moves to his turn, and Ren responds by flashing in Hushwing Griff. I respond to this by casting Torrential Gearhulk. I flash back Mystic Confluence, and then draw 3 cards. Ren then moves to his turn.
Ren starts his turn by evoking Revelark, and Chris draws a card. Revelark is sacrificed, and Ren returns Windborn Muse and Cloudblazer to the battlefield. Hushwing Griff prevents him from gaining 2 life or drawing 2 cards, causing Ren to feel very sad. Moving to combat, Ren attacks Chris with his Griff, dealing him 2 damage. He then passes to Alex.
I begin my turn by casting Thought Vessel. Chris responds by casting Render Silent, and I am left unable to cast spells for the rest of my turn. Plans ruined, I discard down to 7 and end my turn.
Chris casts Land Tax, followed by Excavation. He plays Forbidding Watchtower as his land for turn and recasts his commander before passing.
Ren plays a Plains and then casts Steel Hellkite. Chris counters this with Dissipate, putting 3+1/+1 counters on his Cascading Cataracts thanks to Noyan Dar. Moving to combat, Ren attacks Chris with Windborn Muse and Hushwing Griff, dealing him 4 damage. He then passes to me and I respond by recasting Raff. Chris draws a card and I move to my turn.
Alex plays Opal Palace and then casts Sensei's Divining Top. He then passes to Chris.
In his turn, Chris plays an island and then casts Abzan Falconer. Next, he casts Return to Dust, targeting my Gearhulk and Divining Top. I respond by activating my top's first ability and then cast Enlightened Tutor. Chris decides not to draw a card and then counters the tutor with Swan Song, giving me a 2/2 bird instead. Knowing what the next 3 cards of my library are, I decide not to save my top and allow it to be exiled along with my Gearhulk. Chris then moves to combat, attacking me with his Inkmoth Nexus. I block with my bird and Chris ends his turn.
In his turn, Ren recasts Land Tax, allowing Chris to draw from Mystic Study. Next he casts Propaganda and Chris draws once more. Ren then passes to Alex.
I play an island and pass the turn. Chris responds by casting Mystic Confluence, returning all 3 of Ren's creatures to his hand. He puts 3 +1/+1 counters on one of his planes, which Ren responds to by casting Swords to Plowshares, targeting Chris's Inkmoth Nexus. Chris activates the Nexus ability to give it an additional point of power. The Nexus is exiled and Chris gains 7 life. Chris then moves to his turn.
In his upkeep, Chris uses land tax to put 3 basic lands into his hand. Next he casts Tagum, Ojutai Master, plays a plains and moves to combat. He pays 4 mana to allow 2 of his creatures to attack Ren and uses Natural Unity to put a +1/+1 counter on his animated plains. Chris then attacks Ren with his plains and Noyan Dar, dealing him 8 damage and then passes the turn.
Land tax triggers in Ren's upkeep and he puts 3 basic lands into his hand. Ren plays a plains and then casts Council's Judgment, and Chris draws a card from Mystic Study. Chris then casts Hinder, to which I respond to by casting Venser, Shaper Savant. I return Hinder to Chris's hand. Chris puts 3 +1/+1 counters on one of his planes and Council's Judgment resolves. Noyan Dar receives the most votes and is subsequently exiled, and Ren recasts Windborn Muse. Ren then ends his turn and I respond by sacrificing my Ancient Tomb and 2 islands to Excavation, drawing 3 cards. I then cast Mystical Tutor, putting Swords to Plowshares on top of my library, and then move to my turn.
Alex draws the Swords to Plowshares from the top of his library and passes to Chris.
Chris plays a plains, and then recasts his commander. Moving to combat, Chris attacks me with his 4/4 plains, and I take 4 damage. Chris then ends his turn.
In Ren's upkeep, Alex casts Swords to Plowshares targeting Chris's Abzan Falconer. Chris chooses not to draw from his study and responds by casting Ether Snatch, redirecting the spell towards Windborn Muse. He puts 3 +1/+1 counters on a plains and Windborn Muse is then exiled. Ren gains 2 life, looks disapprovingly at Alex and recasts Cloudblazer. He gains 2 life, draws 2 cards, plays an island and casts a Rhystic Study of his own. Chris draws from his Rhystic Study and Ren passes to Alex, who responds by recasting Gilded Lotus. Not quite finished, he recasts Coalition Relic, paying for Chris's study but not for Ren's. Ren draws a card, Alex puts a charge counter on his relic and then sacrifices 2 lands to Excavation to draw 2 cards. He then moves to his turn.
In my turn I sacrifice another land to draw another card. I then do this 2 more times, drawing 2 more cards, and then cast Elspeth, Sun's Champion. Ren draws a card, Chris chooses not to draw a card, and Chris responds by casting Hinder, putting the card on the bottom of my library. He then puts 3 +1/+1 counters on one of his planes, and I cast Sky Sovereign Console Flagship, destroying Chris's Falconer with its Enter the Battlefield trigger. Chris once again chooses not to draw, and Ren draws another card. I then pass the turn.
Chris plays an island and then casts Terror Eternal. Moving to combat, Chris pays 2 mana to attack Ren with one of his planes and uses his Conspiracy to put a +1/+1 counter on it. He also attacks Alex with his 3/3 and 4/4 planes, and Alex crews his flagship with his commander, blocking the larger of the 2. Ren takes 7 damage, Alex takes 3 and Chris ends his turn.
Ren plays Blighted Cataracts, and then casts Karmic Guide. Chris counters it with Spell Swindle, allowing Ren to draw for his Rhystic Study. Chris then makes 5 treasure tokens and puts 3 +1/+1 counters on one of his lands. Not yet finished, Ren casts Warden of Evos Isles, and Chris draws from his study. He then recasts Selfless Spirit, allowing Chris to draw once more, and then passes to me.
Alex begins his turn by playing Darksteel Citadel, and then casts Return to Dust, targeting Chris's Terror Eternal and Sacred Ground. He pays 1 extra for Chris's study, but not for Ren's, allowing Ren to draw, and then Chris counters Alex's spell with Disallow. Ren draws another card, Chris puts 3 +1/+1 counters on one of his planes, and Alex passes the turn.
Chris plays an island, and then moves to combat. He attacks me with his army of planes, and uses Natural Unity to give 3 of his lands +1/+1 counters. I respond to this by casting Blessed Alliance, asking Chris to sacrifice an attacking creature. I once again only pay for Chris's study, allowing Ren to draw a card. Chris sacrifices a plains, which is then returned to the battlefield as a result of Sacred Ground. I then crew my Sky Sovereign, using it to block the 4/4 and block the 8/8 with Venser. I take 8 damage and Chris passes to Ren.
In his upkeep, Ren searches his library for 3 basic lands thanks to land tax. He plays the Plains and then casts Gravitational Shift. Moving to combat, Ren attacks Chris with all 3 of his creatures and Chris responds by casting Settle the Wreckage. Ren puts 3 basic land onto the battlefield and moves to his post-combat main phase. He casts Island Sanctuary, discards down to 7 and then ends his turn. Alex responds to this by flashing in Mind Stone, allowing Ren to draw a card, but not Chris. He then sacrifices the stone to draw a card and proceeds to his turn.
I begin my turn by playing Memorial to Genius, and then sacrifice Darksteel Citadel to Excavation in order to draw a card. I then pass the turn.
Chris plays an island and then casts Devastation Tide. Being unable to counter this thanks to Tegum, Ren casts Reality Shift, targeting the monk. Riss sacrifices a land to Excavation to draw a card, then draws from Rhystic Study. Reality Shift resolves, Chris manifests the top card of his library, and Alex casts Pact of Negation. Ren and Chris both draw, Devastation Tide is countered, and Chris puts 3+1/+1 counters on a Plains. Not to be deterred, Chris casts Hour of Revelation. Alex and Ren finally run out of counter spells, Chris puts 3+1/+1 counters on a land, and all non-land permanents are destroyed. Chris uses his Conspiracy to distribute +1/+1 counters on his lands, then attacks Alex and Ren for lethal damage, ending the game. Well, that was certainly an interesting game. Thank you so much to Charla for suggesting that we try it. Don't forget to give this video a like if you want to see more like it, and subscribe to the channel to ensure that you never miss an upload. Also, feel free to follow us on Twitter, @4commander, and check out our Patreon page, link in the description. We'll see you next time.